and welcome to the Seeking Justice podcast, episode 4, joined by a very special guest, a super emergency physician based down in Tasmania, Dr. Natalie Thurtle, a former client of mine, but also not any longer, and we're not discussing anything to do with that. But it's been a pleasure to meet Nat, and I wanted to get her on because she's done some amazing work with Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, including in Palestine. Also some amazing work around the world regarding lead poisoning. And I'll just give a quick overview from her CV. She's currently the Director of Emergency, or the Co-Director of Emergency Medicine for Northwest Tasmania, and a full-time specialist in emergency medicine, holding portfolios in trauma, rural education and toxicology. She's been a specialist since 2016, having had a diverse training experience, including in large tertiary centres in London and Sydney, remote regional in Alice Springs and Townsville, and internationally in emergency medicine in Mosul, Iraq, Gaborone, Botswana. In August 2019, she completed a 2-year role as emergency medicine staff specialist and toxicology fellow at Prince of Wales in Sydney. She's also worked with Médecins Sans Frontières as an intermissioner since 2008, incorporating a humanitarian career alongside training in emergency medicine and toxicology. She was deployed as the medical coordinator for Palestine in Jerusalem for MSF France in 2020 to 2021. And she also spent 6 weeks with Médecins Sans Frontières as medical coordinator, deputy medical coordinator in November, December 2023 in Jerusalem, obviously post 7th of October. So I want to talk a bit about that and what's going on. The role when she was in Palestine and Jerusalem in 2020, 2021 included country medical responsibility for MSF's projects in Palestine, including a large conflict-related trauma, osteomyelitis, reconstructive surgery, and burns multidisciplinary intervention in Gaza. Médecins Sans Frontières also runs a complex mental health service in the West Bank and COVID-19 case management hybrid intervention models with Ministry of Health in both Gaza and the West Bank. Natalie Dr. Thurtle was responsible for medical operational strategy and quality, and for a medical budget of approximately 7 million euros, holding relationships with the ministries, the United Nations and other actors, and responsible for risk management in conjunction with the head of mission, as well as the staff health for over 200 staff during the COVID-19 pandemic. Natalie, welcome.
Thanks.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. It's a lovely sunny day in Tasmania. It's a lovely sunny day in Tasmania.
Beautiful. And where are you exactly in Tasmania?
I'm in the northwest, so up out west of Burnie.
Right on. And you've been gardening today?
I have done a little bit of gardening, yes.
Is that
mostly child parenting in the garden, but low achievements, shall we say?
Oh, that's all right. It's all good to have low achievements. I think the high achievers have low achieving weekends, keep things balanced, maybe. So I wanted to talk to you mainly because I have perhaps some career regret, because I always wanted to become a doctor or a medical practitioner. But thankfully, probably for any prospective patients I might have had, I didn't, because I get very queasy looking at blood and other things. So it was probably good that I never ventured into that. But I was always enamoured with Médecins Sans Frontières and Doctors Without Borders, and I've known friends and parents of friends who have worked with them. What got you into working for Médecins Sans Frontières?
So I think I didn't know what I was getting into. I think I had, probably, if I'm completely honest, early on a white saviour mindset. And I will admit that, because I think it's not uncommon, at least in 2008 when I was thinking about working with Médecins Sans Frontières. And I wanted to give something back from a very privileged position. And I didn't really know what that entailed. And I think that was my starting point when I started engaging with the organisation, when I applied to work with the organisation. And I think I hope I fairly quickly was absorbed of those ideas and kind of realised more depth to what it meant to go to some of the difficult contexts where Médecins Sans Frontières is working, and to try to add something, which I think is actually really hard to do. And so my first mission was in Sri Lanka in 2008 as one of the emergency doctors working there during the conflict in the north of Sri Lanka at that time. So I found it very confronting medically. I'd never been in a conflict zone before. I didn't know much about the context, or I think it's very difficult to know a lot about the context before you go somewhere like that. It was a real learning experience for me in terms of medical conditions and what we were treating in terms of conflict-related injuries, but also the infrastructure there and how my Sri Lankan colleagues were working and the culture, and what was the possibility for me to support them and to work with them. I guess that's kind of how I got started, and I
and can I just interject and ask then,
sure.
In terms of your privileged background, as you say, where had you immediately travelled from to go to Sri Lanka? Because that was, of course, during the Civil War, and there were a lot of war crimes committed, because I worked on a project, the International Crimes Evidence Project, which, because the international community failed to intervene yet again, a group of young lawyers from Australia put together a brief of evidence over about 3 years, and I volunteered looking at the unlawful use of cluster munitions and white phosphorus, and that dossier was then fed into the UN Human Rights Council, and they began an investigation. Then the government changed and they said, "Oh, it's all right, we'll continue the investigation," and probably nothing happened. But that's really interesting. Where had you grown up, and where had you studied, and what led you to study medicine?
So I'm from the UK, and I moved around a bit when I was a kid, but I grew up a lot in Cambridge, so in the east of the UK, and then I went to university in Liverpool. I didn't come from an extremely privileged background by English standards, but I guess my reflection is that any background where you are in a safe country and you're able to access education and you have a home and you have access to food and water is a privileged background. And it's not something that's earned, and it's something that is bestowed on us by nature of where we happen to have been born. And I guess I've always had a strong sense of that. And I think that's why I have been attracted to emergency medicine as well, but certainly why I have an ongoing investment in engaging in difficult humanitarian contexts.
And what led you to study medicine? Was there a particular... Was it something you'd wanted to do since childhood? Was there other doctors in your family? What was it that kind of inspired?
I kind of fell into studying medicine, which I think you probably can't do these days because it's so competitive. But I was doing quite different things. I was doing arts-based subjects and working in the acting sort of and music arena. And then I realised that I didn't really have the talent to succeed in this domain, and I kind of reevaluated things and thought that I would go back to school and study some subjects to go to nursing college. So whilst I was doing this, I was lucky enough to have a really great teacher who believed in me and motivated me and sort of encouraged me to consider medicine. And then I sort of started applying myself a little bit more, which hadn't always been my strong suit, shall we say. And the rest is history, I guess. So I kind of wound up at medical school and hadn't had this huge drive to be there, and really had to spend some time finding out where I fitted into this, if I fitted into this. And I think that definitely took me some time. I think I didn't really feel comfortable or confident being at medical school until third or fourth year. And it took me some time to find where I wanted to be as a doctor. Like, I still don't consider myself as particularly academic or science focused, and I think I've always considered medicine as a social endeavour, which can be a strength, but it's not the way it's promoted sometimes. And
Amazing. I can't let you get away with mentioning a thespian and rock star career. What a slight digression. What were you doing? What were you interested in?
Well, I did mention that I had some talent deficits. So I sang with a local jazz group.
Great.
And I used to do musical theatre. So I was in the National Youth Musical Theatre for a few years in the UK. And I did some acting in different plays and Shakespeare festivals and things like that, and a couple of things in London. And I enjoyed it.
Excellent.
But I think it wasn't quite the right direction for me.
And favourite Shakespeare play and favourite musical theatre?
I think my favourite Shakespeare would have to be Macbeth.
Okay.
It's very deep, and I was lucky enough to play Lady Macbeth in an amateur production, actually. But I really enjoyed the opportunity. It was fascinating kind of journey into introspection of what it is to be a human and how humans become corrupted and things like that. Musical theatre, I like all the old Gilbert and Sullivans, actually.
Oh yeah.
But there's lots of great stuff out there. So
when you get tired of medicine, you can bounce back into some Gilbert and Sullivans.
I think those days might be over. But, I'm living vicariously through my child now, so
wonderful.
She's interested.
Yes, that's definitely the way to live your dream career 100%. As well. I'm doing the same, I think. So I'm really interested in your, I guess, awareness, emotional intelligence around, a white saviour complex, and then stepping or evolving from that. And also very interested in your first deployment to Sri Lanka. So, do you find out about MSF from colleagues and you go to a presentation and you think it's interesting, you sign up? Do they give you training before they deploy you? What happened? What were the steps? Where were you living when you then went to Sri Lanka?
So MSF has evolved a lot since I was recruited. So I think things in terms of what's provided to people prior to being sent on assignment, I think it's definitely a little more comprehensive, shall we say. I think I had heard about MSF on the news and things like that, and actively pursued the pathway of how do I get involved in this. And at the time, the recommendation was to do a diploma in tropical medicine. And so I did that prior to seeking to be recruited. And that was a good opportunity to meet people who had actually worked in some of the contexts that I was interested in and sort of get some insights around that, because I really was very green and didn't know what I was getting into at all. I think that what we, in advance, they do a pre-preparation departure course. I think they still call it that, where they sort of send you on a week with other potential MSF recruits, and you learn about the organisation and do various exercises together, and have more of an understanding about the structures of MSF, because MSF, like any organisation, has its own culture and its own kind of hierarchies and rules, and it can be a bit impenetrable when you're sort of trying to understand that for the first time in a high stress context. And then
so where were you just before you deployed to Sri Lanka?
I was back in Liverpool, so I had been over in Australia for a bit, and then I'd gone back to Liverpool to do the diploma in tropical medicine. I was doing some anaesthetic training at the time as well, so I did 9 months of anaesthetics while I was in Liverpool, which was helpful for working in emergency in Sri Lanka as well. And then in Sri Lanka we were based in Point Pedro, which is in the north near Jaffna. I did move around a little bit as need required, but that was the main place that we were working.
And how long for there?
8 months.
And so have you found that with if there's any doctors or medical students who want to kind of follow a path into that work and humanitarian work, have you found it easy to negotiate with your employers to kind of have that leave in order to be able to go and do that? Or I guess it just depends. I think
it's variable. I think it's getting a bit more difficult, unfortunately, because I think that, and certainly this is not the purpose of it, but I think it's worth noting that certainly, at least for me, a lot of my managerial skill set and my capacity for navigating complex situations in my current role, or in senior roles that I've done back in Australia, has had a lot of those learning experiences were within my humanitarian career. So, and I mentioned that because I think it's really a little bit short-sighted sometimes that the training programs and the colleges don't really recognise or value some of these experiences in the way that they should. That said, my own experience was quite positive, and I had lots of great champions and sponsors throughout my emergency medicine training who were trying to find ways for me to be able to do this. And I think emergency medicine is amenable to it in general, because you can sort of do a standalone job and you come to the end of that job and you don't have anything lined up, and then you can do a mission with MSF, and then you come back and then you apply for another job.
Yeah,
and that's still a reasonable thing to do in your training with emergency medicine. I think it's a lot more complex in other specialties. And I mean, also, it's since I've been a consultant, it's less complex because you have more autonomy.
You're higher up the chain. You've got more freedom and agency. And just a practical question, but when you do go on deployment, is it mostly volunteer capacity, or is there a stipend? Do you get board, lodging, food? I mean, how does it work?
There is a stipend, and you do get your board and food covered generally. It's a bit dependent on where you are, what your seniority is, and that kind of thing. But it's not something that you have to completely self-fund or anything like that. It's funded by the organisation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because I noted when I was reading from your CV before, when you deployed to Jerusalem in 2020, 2021, that was for MSF France. Is there just different missions you can go with different country parts of the organisation?
I think parts of the idiosyncrasy of MSF is that it has a very convoluted operational structure with 5 operational bases in Europe, which, is up for regular and highly valid discussion as to, whether that's a good use of MSF revenue. However, that is the structure at present.
Yeah.
So I may have written that on that CV because it was a CV I was sending to MSF or something, and you sometimes need to note which operational centre you've been working for. But overall, MSF is one movement, and when we're communicating as one movement. So it's not so relevant outside of sort of operations and things like that.
Yeah. And parlez-vous français?
Un petit peu.
That's about me as well. But you don't, it's not required because obviously they've anglicised. Doctors Without Borders, mate. So it's all right.
So you have French-speaking missions, Spanish-speaking missions, English-speaking missions where you must be fluent.
Yes.
And mostly I work in English-speaking missions. I'm not good enough in French to work in a high-stakes communication situation. Sure. I'd like to be, but I'm not.
Alliance Française or Duolingo?
I have indeed done both of those. So.
Yeah, I have too.
Yeah.
So just then bouncing back to this idea of white saviordom, because I think it's a really interesting theme, and I think it's I think when it comes to all kinds of development and humanitarian work, I think it's very relevant. But is that something that occurred to you over time, or was it something that just kind of hit you during that first deployment in Sri Lanka? What was the kind of evolution?
I think that I had some seeds around what colonialism was and thoughts around that, but no real depth of understanding. And even now, it's still a learning process. I still get schooled on that on a regular basis, and I make mistakes in that domain on a regular basis, and learn more, I think, from colleagues and from some discussion groups that I'm in about what that can look like, because I think it's not as, I think the white saviour kind of concept is a bit reductionist, and it's a lot more than not going over there and pretending you're going to fix everything, or, that's a very basic concept around the humanitarian colonialization kind of argument. It's a lot deeper and a lot more subtle than that. And there's people, ex-MSFers, I guess, and other people who will argue that we should not be present in a lot of places, and that we're feeding an industry and all these issues. So there's lots of different perspectives out there. My own perspective is that I think there is a place for MSF to work in a lot of these contexts. And the devil is in how do we work as individuals and as the organisation to not perpetuate some of the problems that colonial behaviours have created and continue to create. So, and I think that can be quite challenging for the organisation and for individuals, and is something that I kind of work against as an individual, and why I quite enjoy being a bit more senior, I guess, these days, because you can shut down some stuff that is driving that agenda, if that makes sense.
Can you give an example, even in a kind of general sense?
I think it's the way that we frame the opinions and views and hierarchy around international staff versus local staff. And, you very frequently got local staff who have been managing something for years and been in that position for years, and international staff who haven't been there very long, perhaps aren't that experienced, and for some reason their opinion, or they have more of a platform to give their opinion than that person who is far superior in their knowledge. And so I really try to actively combat that when I'm in a position to do so, and to really elevate those who are in, from the communities where we're trying to provide assistance. And I think that what we can bring, though, and I'm reflecting particularly about Palestine, is resourcing and a freshness, because you're very often, especially in conflict, working with people that are deeply, deeply traumatized and fatigued. And what that does to your cognitive capacity, what that does to your productivity, your ability to stay regulated and to be creative about solution finding and things like that, it just destroys a lot of these things. And therefore, there is a role to work alongside people in those environments to provide some of that neurological resourcing, as well as, cold hard cash and stuff that they need, and technical support and those kind of things. But that's a very difficult landscape to navigate safely and successfully and meaningfully.
Yeah. I mean, and just on that note, from an outsider watching, there's been a lot of interviews with international doctors who have returned from Gaza. I was watching one the other day, a British Palestinian nerve surgeon on this excellent podcast. And yeah, I mean, it's just amazing what the levels of dedication, I guess, but then goes to fatigue. They'd all lost weight. He was talking because they hadn't had sufficient food. They were treating people, pretty much 24/7. And then dealing with the local medical staff, dealing with their families being killed or injured or bombed. Of course, the Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, who's still in custody, with that iconic photo of him walking towards the tank when the IDF was bombing. I mean, I'm not sure how many hospitals he has been in that have been directly targeted, but and I saw an update that he has now been allowed to visit by his lawyer, so hopefully he's all right. But yes, I mean it's mind blowing to see that the level of dedication, and I guess that you go into a different cognitive operating space when you're in a conflict zone. Would you agree with that? In terms of your being deployed in Sri Lanka for that first time, but then also your deployments to Palestine?
I think when you're in active conflict and there's a lot of conflict going on in the immediate vicinity, that definitely puts you into a heightened mental mode, and that can be useful in terms of speeding your brain up and giving you fatigue resistance, etc., at least for a period of time. But if you're in that situation for 15 months, which is what's happened to our colleagues in Palestine, those things are not sustainable, just physiologically. And so, and amazingly, many of them have sustained themselves and managed to continue working. But the toll that working in that environment for that length of time takes, and the sort of recovery period from something like that. Also acknowledging that prior to this happening, people were not living in a normal environment, and they've been living under duress often for their entire life. So, I mean, what that does to your psychological makeup, your neurotransmitter receptors, and all of these things, and your physical health. It's well studied, actually, and it's really devastating.
Can you talk about your deployment in 2020, 2021? Just about what you were, what your mission was, I guess, and how it panned out.
So that was prior to where we currently are. But I think it's important to note that, as I was just saying, that the situation then was really pretty desperate. And for people in Gaza living under siege, it's extraordinary, like how for them to try to access medical care, it's very difficult for them to move outside of Gaza. There was the lots of poverty, 50%, approaching 50% unemployment, because of lack of opportunities for employment to grow there. And it's a very young population. So you've got sort of almost 50% of people in Gaza under 18. And what we were working on at the time was related primarily to the Great March of Return. And so we had a cohort of generally young men who had been injured in that fairly long-standing process, and they usually had lower limb injuries, which were quite life-changing, and had shattered lower limbs, and then had multiple episodes of infections and multiple operations. And they're just very difficult to treat those injuries successfully.
Is that often from sniper fire that we've all heard about? Taking shots at people's knees and shins and calves and that kind of, is that right? What you're talking about, difficult to treat?
Yeah, so people approaching the wall and then being shot at. So and they're just in the context of Gaza, it's very difficult to treat those kind of injuries successfully because it requires infrastructure and systems. And care in Gaza is very fragmented because a lot of it's provided by INGOs, and the ministry is not well resourced, not functioning very well a lot of the time, because of the duress that the whole area is under. And so you'll have someone with an injury, they'll have surgery, perhaps not the best quality initial debridement, and then they'll get an infection, and then they'll go to MSF and have a surgery, and then they'll go to MAP UK and have a surgery, and the last surgeon, they don't have any records that are shared, and so the last surgeon won't know what they did, and then they'll get some antibiotics from the pharmacy because antibiotic regulation's not very good in Gaza, but it won't treat the bug that they have. There's a huge problem with multi-resistant organisms and antibiotic resistance. So it's just a very complex injury. They need psychosocial support. They've got chronic pain, issues with opioids, lots and lots of different facets. And we actually tried to meet that need as MSF. So we had trauma surgeons, we had infectious diseases specialists, we had physiotherapy, occupational therapy, dressings, orthotics, and psychosocial support and chronic pain and addiction services under one roof. Yep. So we had 4 clinics where we were providing that sort of care, and then we had a hospital-based program as well. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps, and we lost people through issues and things like that. But it was about as good as we could get it. And I think it sounds so minor when you think about the loss of life. Almost 50,000 people reported to have been killed. But it was devastating to know that has all gone. I mean, so many people over so many years put so much work into building that that complex medical organism for these patients to access care, and it's just gone. And I think similarly with burns, we were seeing like that 5,000 burns cases a year with a complex infrastructure around burn management, because burns are difficult to manage.
And what were they from?
Now,
what were the burns from? From blast injuries and that?
Some, but a lot of domestic stuff as well because of the cramped conditions. So Gaza, as you know, is one of the most densely populated, or was one of the most densely populated places on earth. And so you've got very cramped, impoverished conditions of people using open flame and, that kind of thing. So a lot of domestic burns and small kids.
Yeah.
And I think all these, and there's so much now that when you think about the burden of disease, it's very overwhelming to think about it now. Of course, it's a relief that there's a ceasefire somehow holding, but to think about the complex medical needs of the people that are there with all these awful injuries, it's really hard to see how that can be met with so few hospitals functioning and the systematic destruction of the medical system in Gaza.
Yeah, absolutely. It really beggars belief. With that complex multidisciplinary system you had in place then, was that something that MSF had tailored for that situation, that mission, or is that something that's kind of adopted around the world in different conflict zones and then kind of tailored to the specific situation to some extent?
I think we have some common models that we can deploy, particularly in acute conflict. But any conflicts where there's chronicity, and perhaps any conflict, I think you really have to look at what's already there, what the needs are, and what needs are also somehow being met, what is being asked for by the ministry or, doctors on the ground. So I think there's a lot of things that kind of go into thinking, should we do something here? And if so, what is it? And then you can start something and then you really need to adapt to how that goes and how it's received and whether it's actually adding value or in fact you missed something, and that can be really difficult because I think getting data in these kind of contexts is very fraught. It's always really hard to scientifically know what's going on, and so sometimes you just have to start something and go, I think that we'll start this and we'll see how it goes. I think in Gaza, like MSF has been in Gaza for decades.
Yep.
So what we had there has grown over many years and adapted or attempted to adapt to the situation. I mean, I think one of the things that's changed quite a bit, I guess, since I started working for MSF, there's a lot more actors often in a particular space now, and certainly in Gaza it was very crowded with people trying to do something with good intentions, but sometimes causing harm or being instrumentalized. And I think it's very easy for MSF to be instrumentalized in a very complicated context, and I think that there's some legitimate discussion about how much MSF's been instrumentalized in this particular conflict.
Sorry, can you just explain that? Can you just explain that concept of being instrumentalized?
Sure. So I think we have, as an organisation, we have clear and good intentions about what we're trying to do and around offering impartial healthcare and not being politicised. But I think when you're in a highly political environment, it's very increasingly difficult to maintain that. And I think you really always have to be aware when you're dealing with the authorities, when you're dealing with local groups, when you're dealing with other INGOs, with UN, with all the landscape, is someone pushing you in a direction that it actually is not adding value and is potentially harmful, or it's achieving an agenda outside of the stated agenda of the organisation.
Yep.
So, and I think that that's just, you have to be confident that you are constantly scanning for that risk.
Yep.
And talking about it. I think, we need to be realistic about the context that we're working in. It's extraordinarily difficult sometimes with many, many actors. And so acknowledging that is the first step to trying to make sure that you're not becoming part of the problem.
Yep. And you mentioned that the situation in Gaza with many actors, a lot of people with good intentions, but is that kind of alluding to the white saviour complex again, coming in where people are wanting to, think they know how it should be, fly in, fly out, without actually taking a read on the ground of people who have been there a long time and are going to be there for a long time after the fly in, fly outs have left?
Absolutely. And I think, that's really where all organisations really need to think about their model in every context that they're working in. And the more that you have transient international staff who are not familiar with the context or the more chaotic it can get and the more risk that you're bringing in. So I think as a manager in MSF, I'm always cognizant of that. And it applies to work outside of MSF. I mean, I work in a low-resource rural setting. We have a lot of transient staff, locum staff, things like that, and they're amazing and they're part of my workforce, but they need orienting and support to understand how things work in our context. And often by the time that orientation has occurred,
they're gone.
They're moving on. And it's the same in MSF.
Yep.
And that's why I really, personally, I'm very reliant on local colleagues always to understand. And you really have to really listen.
Yep.
And because there's often been a power dynamic, and MSF has kind of, is at risk of participating in that power dynamic between international and local staff. People aren't always willing to share openly initially. So you need to really facilitate that. I've definitely come unstuck where someone has said yes and meant no.
Yep.
And yeah.
No, it's fascinating and so important. I mean, the nerve surgeon I was listening to definitely made that point that you've just made about people coming in very briefly and, I guess just also the resources that it takes to invest in orienting someone and then they leave. So, Nat, what took you back to Palestine in November, December 2023? What happened? Well, obviously October the 7th happened, but what happened for you personally?
I think that this was common to many colleagues who have been lucky enough to spend time in Palestine. I think we all, I know that you've watched some videos of Tanya Hassan. I think that it was very different. What was happening. We've all been exposed to historical context, and bad as that was, and these big aggressions in the past on Gaza. But this was very different, and what people were saying and the way that they were talking, as in colleagues and people on the ground, was different.
Sorry, the way that not Israeli government leaders and the Prime Minister and the President were talking, but you mean what colleagues were saying in those first weeks after, and the response, like the bombardments, the airstrikes.
Yeah, I mean, Palestinians are incredibly strong, and I don't want to generalize, but my colleagues who are in Palestine that I know are incredibly strong, resilient, seasoned, unfortunately, conflict survivors, and the way that they were speaking about this was different. It was, people were very frightened and thought that that Gaza was going to be razed to the ground, and certainly that is what's happened. And I think that we could see that was starting, and the rhetoric and what politicians were saying and things like that, and what they were getting away with saying was indicative of that. And so I think a lot of us who had a history working there felt compelled to offer ourselves because of our history there. And I think for me that was what I thought might be added value to MSF, because I had a network there, I had colleagues there and friends there, and I know the context as much as anyone can in 2 years of being there. And for sure there's people with much deeper knowledge than me. But I knew the team. And I think that having that skill set early on in something like this was potentially going to add something. And so that was why I put myself forward, and I said, just if you want me to go, just call me. I can go in 3 days. And I spoke to my boss here, and they were very supportive. So that was how it happened. And it turned out that the team on the ground in the coordination in Jerusalem were extraordinary. They're really excellent team, but needed a break as well at that time. So they brought in a few of us to facilitate that, and to support a bit with the historical knowledge of the context. And
what was the focus for that work that you were doing there and the other team that you'd relieved?
I think it was pivoting the entire operation really from quite a detailed, chronic, comprehensive service in Gaza to complete emergency response in a very, very small and dangerous humanitarian space. And so we worked on what was possible, which wasn't very much. And also trying to figure out what was happening to the staff and trying to support them. So I was involved, I won't talk about it in detail, but I was involved in the evacuation of our staff from the north, from the medical side as well.
From the north, you said?
Yeah, so we were trying to support our staff and their families moving from the north at that time when it was really the ground invasion had started. There was a very complex operation, and
did you have a hospital? You kind of have field hospitals, or what? What does MSF do?
We do now. At that time, we were trying to maintain the support that we're providing at the hospitals that already existed. Because overall, MSF does not support the building of field hospitals because there's existing structures in Gaza that need to be supported. So, unfortunately, in the end, because of the systematic destruction of the healthcare system, the field hospital did become inevitable. But at that time, it was really about agility. We're working here, but tomorrow this place is going to be right in the middle of the war. So we need to be able to move what we're doing here to this place, and identifying new places within Gaza to that we potentially could work and live as well. So that was very challenging. And then in the West Bank, I mean, we had a long-standing presence in the West Bank providing mental health support, but we wanted to acknowledge and engage in the aggressions that were increasing in the West Bank. And so we started up an emergency response there as well. And so I was part of supporting the team on the ground to develop that. And we did a lot, just cycling back to our role as international people in this matter, usually I'm very, or at least have become, I guess, quite reluctant to speak in the media about the conflict zones where I work, because it's I'd rather have somebody from the place if they're willing.
Yes.
I would rather elevate the voices of colleagues. With this conflict, it's been very difficult to get traction for Palestinian people to speak, and they are at risk. They are censored. They are not listened to, more so than in any other context. And therefore, there's a reinvigorated mandate for people like me to speak and use the platforms that we have to speak about what we have seen and what our colleagues have seen and what they've gone through. So I did a lot of media when I was I was there.
With international media, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have reached out. Well, I've interviewed a young man in Gaza, and I've got a couple of other people lined up to interview. I have reached out to some doctors. As I noted, I've seen a number of international doctors, but also Palestinian doctors interviewed on podcasts, but usually not from, I think it's probably very dangerous to do it from Gaza, for example, especially when health care professionals have been targeted and murdered and massacred on a unprecedented level. When you were there in post-2023 and even in 2020, 2021, were you, and bearing in mind you'd been doing it for over a decade, these deployments, but were you scared?
No. I think I always pivot this question because it can be an intense experience, but I mean, you're walking towards that experience. You're living and working with people every single day who have absolutely no choice but to live their entire life, to birth their children, to bury their parents in that environment. So I think it's not really the right thing for our emotions to take up space. Now, of course, like, we're all human and we have emotions, but I'm astonished by the capacity of my Palestinian colleagues to survive that. But there is no other choice. And of course they are afraid. They are in a much more vulnerable position than we ever are.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to note, because politically, unfortunately, it's less appealing for the Israelis or anybody else to kill international member of staff.
Yep.
Killing Palestinians is not met with the same response, but from the media or the international community, and that's part of the horrible devaluation of Palestinian lives that goes on. And it's not just Palestinians. I mean, it's happening in many contexts like that. So the risk to us is genuinely much lower than it is to our colleagues in Palestine. I guess I center their emotions and their experience while I'm there, but also when I'm talking about it outside.
Yeah. I guess, though, in being a different situation post-October 7 and with, what turned out to be indiscriminate carpet bombing of just huge amounts of munitions in such a tiny area, I guess everyone was under threat. I've been thinking...
I think that's... sorry, but I think that is an important point, because when I first started working with MSF, I felt somehow confident in international humanitarian law, somehow felt that we wouldn't be actively targeted whilst providing medical care. And that is gone.
Yeah.
And the first time that I felt how tangibly that is completely gone was in Palestine. And I'm in it's not safe for anyone in Gaza now. And I think that does make it very difficult. It makes you have a lot of sleepless nights when you're managing a team in that scenario, local staff and international staff, because there's no rules anymore.
And it's almost like you could have a Red Cross or a Red Crescent, and that's a target now rather than a point of protection.
And we absolutely felt like that. Not me personally, but the team that I was managing, that's how it was perceived, for sure.
Yeah. On the point of the resilience and ingenuity and innovation of Palestinians through, the historical sieges and what has gone on. I mean, it's remarkable. You hear these statistics about, Gaza being the most densely populated place on planet Earth, but they also had some of the highest literacy rates. There were over 30 universities. They've all been bombed to smithereens. The young man I interviewed the other day for the first episode, he is studying English literature at, I think, Al-Aqsa University, which is completely gone. But his degree is apparently still going. He doesn't know what's going to happen with that. But, and I don't know if you know, and obviously I'd love to talk to some Palestinian medical professionals, doctors about this, but I presume some Palestinians travel abroad to study medicine, but then they also had medical schools within Palestine. The thing that really amazes me, and just going to the point on you and MSF being involved in providing mental health, what I've been reflecting on, I guess, is this kind of juxtaposition of two societies, Israel and, Gaza or Palestine. And just on the human brain, neurology, the human experience. But when people grow up in traumatic environments and conflict zones, or even in traumatic historical conflict, like the Holocaust and thousands of years of pogroms, etc., it would be easy to think that everyone just turns into a monster. Everyone turns into a fighter. Everyone wants to, Antony Blinken at his valedictory speech was basically like, well, we haven't won any of the war goals because now the Hamas recruits are up to what they were, because probably, I imagine, their family blown to smithereens, they, part of the human condition is they want revenge, etc., etc. But having said this, there's all these amazing and beautiful poets, I'm trying to hold the book up, poets that come out of Palestine. There's all these amazing academics that come out of Palestine. There's all these amazing medical professionals, carers, people who care. They don't want to kill, they want to care for humanity. And that really intrigues me. I don't know what the answer is, why some people react differently to those situations. You could almost say there's an analogy to child abuse, that some people become perpetrators and some people become rescuers or carers to try and make sure it never happens to anyone else. I don't know if you have any reflections on that, but it really, it just amazes me the amount of, the beauty, particularly in the poetry that I've been reading, out of Palestine, or it could be other war zones. It really, I find it incredibly inspirational and completely perplexing as well.
Yeah. I don't know why that happens, but I don't think that people have agency to choose which path they follow. I mean, I think that the components that make up who we become and how we behave are very complex, to do with environment and genetics, right? I think historically that has been my experience also in Palestine, that people are incredibly well read and creative and well educated, and that's a cultural component of resistance in Palestine. I do think that what's happened now is so devastating and so grief-inducing and so prolonged, and it's very hard for anyone mentally to survive. And to preserve those qualities. And I think people are just surviving. They have just been surviving for a long time. And people that I know quite well and I know as being beautiful, thoughtful souls are just shells now. And maybe that will change in time if the ceasefire holds, if they don't get removed from their land. And I mean, who knows what's going to happen next? That's the thing. Who knows?
Yeah.
But maybe they will be able to reconnect with that part of themselves. But I'm not sure, because this is different. And I think that's how it's been since the start. So, yeah, I think it's certainly evidence-based that people become more and more embittered and want to fight, and they're literally fighting for their survival. So it's not unreasonable to expect that more people will move in that direction. And also, because it's such a young population, when brains are developing, if they have these experiences when they're developing, it's far, far more harmful than if you have adults who are exposed to that. So I think that's important. So I don't think, and this is something like we've talked a lot about in the past, MSF, like how we provide mental health support to this population. And we do have this quite technical, complex mental health support program in Nablus in the West Bank. But, I mean, there's no medicine for this. There's no therapy for this. Like, it's just an overwhelming insult on so many levels. And that's not to say we shouldn't try to provide mental health care and that you can't support people and you can't offer something. But recovering from this volume of trauma is very complex and difficult, and really scars, deep scars for life on these children primarily. So it's very confronting.
Yeah, and just on the point about, I don't know if you're aware of any medical schools that existed previously within Palestine, or were people trained there, or was it mainly going overseas to train and then come back?
No, there's medical schools in Palestine, or there were. And then people, it's more postgraduate training that's challenging.
Yes.
So, and that's difficult. And I think now with the huge volume of loss of prominent and experienced Palestinian doctors, it's very hard to then reinforce postgraduate training. And that was the situation when I was there. And, you know, there were just a couple of psychiatrists in Gaza, even in 2020, 2021. And therefore, it's very hard to think how we can have a psychiatry training program in this context. So that's very, very challenging. And also, in addition to the number of doctors that have been killed, you also got people of means who have moved away, during this, because if you had means, why would you not?
Yeah.
And obviously that's very difficult for people in Gaza, but I know people in the West Bank have moved. So that is one of the unseen consequences of something, a devastation on this scale, is that you lose so much of your educated people who have means.
Yeah. The brain drain, as it were. Okay, well, look, thank you so much for your time. I did want to talk to you about lead poisoning today and toxicology. I have worked on investigating class actions in that regard, and I have a bit of a background in that, but we might have to reschedule, if you're keen, for another chat. What's that?
I can talk a lot about lead poisoning, so
okay.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, we can schedule that 3-hour one then for lead poisoning. But yeah, look, thank you so much, and it's really, really interesting and insightful, the experiences that you've had, and what of the future for Dr. Thurtle? What are your plans at the moment in terms of your practice in Tasmania and any other work with MSF?
I consider working with MSF as a separate vocation to working in medicine, and they are both emergency medicine. They are both vocational jobs, and so therefore it's kind of with you in your life. I don't have any plans immediately to go back to work with MSF, mostly just because I have my hands full here.
Yeah.
But I almost certainly will again. And I believe in the work that we can do with the organisation, and I think influencing that work and how it goes forward is a really important thing for those of us who've been around for a long time. I really enjoy working down here, and it's a lower resource setting, so it kind of gels with my experience base, but it can get pretty busy. So doing that for the foreseeable future.
Wonderful. And you mentioned before we started recording that your husband is an anthropologist, and he also had worked with MSF.
That's right. I think he keeps me humble as well. Anthropologists think doctors are, need some lessons in health behaviours and how people interface with healthcare, and he's absolutely right a lot of the time. So I think that's been really useful for me. I think this might be a spoiler, but I think he's planning to go this year with MSF somewhere. So,
amazing.
Yeah.
So MSF take up a broad range of professions. It's not as if your husband's going to be starting Anthropologists Without Borders, because perhaps they already have no borders.
Indeed. No, I think he'll be going back in an operational role or a research role. I'm not sure yet. But,
amazing. Yeah. Excellent. That's very exciting. To keep, and of course, we can't forget, and I did forget at the beginning, but you're doing your PhD in toxicology and lead poisoning. Is that right? Should I even mention that?
Yeah. Currently on hiatus, but yes.
Bubbling away in the background, yeah. And is that through, do you do that through which university?
University of Sydney.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, yep. Okay. Very interesting. And how long to go?
I need to just pull it all together.
Yes.
Let's say. So I'm doing a PhD by publication, so I've got a couple of extra papers that I need to finalise and then pull all the thesis together. So allegedly it should happen next year, but I don't know. Let's see.
Wonderful. Yeah, well, good luck with that. A great achievement when you get there. In the tradition of this podcast, which is very new, a new tradition, but poems or musical theatre at the end of, you could do a Gilbert and Sullivan, some Shakespeare.
I don't know. You asked me this question in the beginning, and I have to say I'm drawing a blank.
A monologue from Macbeth. I didn't give I didn't give you enough warning. It's true.
Why don't you read me one of the poems from the book you have?
Okay, that sounds good. So this is the wonderful, beautiful Mossab Abu Toha, Things You May Find Hidden in My Ear. And the poem that I found with a bit of a medical, metaphorical theme is the title poem, Things You May Find Hidden in My Ear, for Alicia M. Quesnel, MD. When you open my ear, touch it gently. My mother's voice lingers somewhere inside. Her voice is the echo that helps me recover equilibrium when I feel dizzy during my attentiveness. You may encounter songs in Arabic, poems in English I recite to myself, or a song I chant to the chirping birds in our backyard. When you stitch the cut, don't forget to put all these back in my ear. Put them back in order, as you would do with the books on your shelf. 2. The drone's buzzing sound, the roar of an F-16, the screams of bombs falling on houses, on fields and on bodies, of rockets flying away. Rid my tiny ear canal. Spray the perfume of your smiles on the incision. Inject the song of life into my veins to wake me up. Gently beat the drum so my mind may dance with yours, my doctor, day and night. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Nat. And I wish I was in Tassie. I'm sure it's beautiful down there. Brisbane's very hot and humid. But I look forward to discussing lead poisoning in the future. And take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.